All right, well, back with the office hours videos. What I'm finding more and more with these, with comments I'm getting, as well as feedback from individuals, is they want to hear more about things that they should do or commonalities I see across all of the mock interviews that I'm doing with Interview At. So if you do have questions, of course, kind of put them in the comments below. That helps me figure out what topics to add in for office hours. But today, what we're going to talk about is one simple thing that I see it over and over again, and I'm surprised that people aren't doing more of this or don't realize that they're not doing this in their interviews. When you are going into an interview, you have to consider the job family, of course, but the level of the role, as well as the kind of size and scope scale of the company that you're targeting. And when you are asked questions about your previous experience or things that you've done, understand that what that company, the members who belong to that, the employees that belong to that company, what they're trying to establish is, can you bring it for that company, right? Will you be able to function there and perform at the level that they expect? And so what I see over and over again, and one of the common pieces of feedback I give, is that people aren't matching their story or their experience that they decide to share, kind of plus or minus the level band that they're targeting, right? And so what ends up happening is they communicate very well something that they've done in their past, but unfortunately, it doesn't present them in a way that leaves the interviewer on the other side of the table thinking, oh yeah, they do great here, right? They start thinking like, oh God, will they be able to function here? Oh gosh, are the problems we deal with too big? Because I say this over and over again all the time. When you walk into an interview, you have to remember this. You're busy all day, every day. You're doing your regular job. Someone says, hey, we're interviewing candidates. They may have looked at your LinkedIn. They might have looked at your resume. If you're really lucky, they've prepared some questions ahead of time that they want to ask you instead of just winging it when they go in, and they've been thoughtful about, what are they going to focus on with you, specifically the candidate. But in reality, you've got a busy professional who doesn't want to be doing interviews but is being forced to, is now coming into a room, doesn't know you from a hole in the wall, and is now trying to assess whether or not you would be a good fit at their company based on what you decide to share. They don't know you. It's nothing personal. It's what you decide to share, and they are living their truth every day. You're living your truth. They're living their truth, and they're trying to match in their head, is what you shared going to work here? And it's not just about, empathy and skill sets and whatnot, but it's also, do you have the ability to scale up to the kinds of problems that they're having here? I've been extremely fortunate to work at some great companies, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. And I will tell you, right, when we were interviewing for the Kindle team, the reality of what we were doing every day, we grew book sales on the Kindle platform to, when I left, just short of $1 billion in revenue. That's a massive number, right? So if I'm interviewing someone who comes in and they tell me, they're really excited about having grown top line revenue from 50,000 to 200K or whatever, in the back of my head, I'm like, okay, but how does that work here, right? Like we're talking about tens of millions of users on the iOS platform alone, right? So you have to be able to match what you're bringing to the table to the level and kind of role expectations of what you're targeting. And bigger companies will absolutely, they will carry themselves in a specific way, right? And the bigger the company, the more important they feel they are, the bigger the problems they're solving, the more revenue, etc. All of this fuels a collective ego within the company. And their day-to-day population of people is going to be super smart people. One of the best and worst things that ever happened to me in my career is that I started as an intern at Microsoft. So I went from an Ivy League institution to Microsoft in the mid-90s, where I was surrounded by geniuses. All day, every day, surrounded by the smartest people I'd ever met, which was incredible. And so I've been very fortunate at the companies I've worked at, generally being surrounded by incredibly smart people. When you are surrounded by incredibly smart people, you want to maintain that. And so you're very cautious about who you invite in. The Amazon bar raiser process was specifically put in place for that reason, right? The bar raiser's job is to ensure that the average IQ of the company goes up with each hire, and it doesn't stagnate or fall. And so if you're going to target a FANG company, you have to understand that the population of the people that the interviewer that you're sitting with is around every day is already a really high bar, and you want to be able to show up with stories and experiences that you share in your interview. They're going to make them take note of you, right? And so in some ways, an easy way to do this a way to think about this is the more senior your role is, the more your stories and experiences should be one-way doors. What do I mean by that? In a diffuse organization where you're functioning well, you've pushed as much decision-making down as far as you can. And the way you do this is you look at the decision-making, you say, look, if it's a two-way door, push that down. Let the lower level people make those decisions, because if it's a two-way door, if it's a mistake and the risk is low and it's a screw up, well, we just undo it and we're fine. But when the stakes are high and the cost is high and it's a one-way door, meaning once you make this decision, you go through this door, you can't undo it. That's where you want the more senior level decisions to be made. And that's going to be rooted in, what was your analysis of your alternatives? How big a scope was a potential impact of a miss here? What was the upside of being right? What are the risks involved, right? All of the analysis framework that you would put into that as a more senior person, the more senior the role, the more one-way doors you want to present in your storytelling to kind of impress upon the person that you're able to match or even exceed their expectations for scale. And I get it. The more junior you are, you're not going to have a ton of those stories. So if you do have a one-way door story and you're a very junior employee, fresh out of college or just a couple of years out of college, stick that in your back pocket and hold on to it, because a one-way door, and if you can frame it that way as a one-way door, meaning, gosh, we had to get this right, we couldn't screw it up, if we got it wrong, huge implications, that actually positions you higher. It makes you look more valuable. So what does this mean, though? The more senior you are, the longer you've been in the workplace, you have to be careful how far back into your experience you reach, because the further back you reach in your experience, the more likely it is you're going to be drawing on experiences which are lesser than what you're doing now. And so the more diminished in stature or size of outcome that your stories present, the less likely it is that you're going to impress the person who's now sitting on the other side of the table from you. So yes, you want to be able to reach back into your experience bag and pull some tricks forward, but my general advice is to try and think about the band of the role that you're going for in terms of leveling, and just do a plus or minus band of about 10 to 15%. It's hard to conceptualize what that even looks like when you're talking about experiences, but you kind of understand what I'm saying, which is, you don't want to go for a director of product management role and then be pulling out your junior individual contributor, associate product manager story as a dive deep example, unless you absolutely killed it and solved nuclear fission or something like that, right? So fission we've solved, fusion. More bloopers. This is now where my science knowledge that I used to have is no longer there, and then I'm just whatever. Okay, so don't want to reach too far back. Want to limit your scope. Usually 3 to 5 years is good. Going past that, unless it's just a great story, leave it there. Or unless you've just kind of gotten to that plateau in your career and your progression is now slowed down because you're just so senior. You're going for a chief product officer role and you pull on a VP product role from 8 years ago. Probably fine. But you just want to limit how much you are impacting yourself and your stature and how you appear to the person on the other side of the table by not matching the level of experience of your story to their expectations for the role. So that's a key, the key takeaway here is when you're going into an interview, no matter the questions that you get asked, always think to yourself, okay, the role I'm going for, if someone was in that role, would they be impressed by this answer, right? One of the reasons why I use the Amazon leadership principles as a way for framing interviews, and I continue to use them, and it's a great way for delivering feedback, but it's also a great way to think about your storytelling. I'm sure I've got an office hours video on storytelling, but at this point, it's one of those things where if you develop your stories, you can match your stories to levels versus always going into an interview kind of, you've prepped for questions and now you're trying to do improv speeches based on questions that you get, and then in that moment trying to match what you're going to do based on an improvised answer to a question you've never heard before because you hadn't really thought through ahead of time. Okay, if I get asked a question about, I don't know, the hardest thing I've ever done, that's, that might be dives deep, might be a write a lot, might be a bias fraction, depending on how the question is asked, but I have a story for that. And I'll have several stories for each of the buckets, especially you want to have many stories developed for each of the leadership principles that are kind of most likely critical for your role. And therefore you're prepared to talk about it versus trying to make something up on the spot.